My name is Todd Hall, and I am a professor in international relations and director of the University of Oxford's China Center. It is my pleasure to bring to you today another episode of One Big Thing in China Research, our series in which we ask scholars to present a finding from their work. Today's guest is Katian Zhang, assistant professor at George Mason University. Professor Zhang has done impressive work looking at how the People's Republic of China employs coercive tactics within its maritime periphery. And so, Professor Zhang, what is your one big thing for today?
Sure. First off, thank you everyone for having me here. So my punchline or the really major conclusion of my research is that the conventional wisdom that China has become steadily more assertive and aggressive since 2010 is not nuanced and is not entirely correct. And in fact, China is highly selective and calculative when it comes to whom, when, and with what tools it is using coercion against. And I would argue that China uses uh, military coercion less when the geopolitical cost is higher, and China calculates the need to establish resolve as well as the economic cost of coercing the target state when it comes to making coercion decisions. So bottom line, it's very calculative when it comes to whether and to whom to use coercion on.
So, are you saying the behavior that it's used hasn't changed over time? Or the tools that it's using? Have those changed over time?
Uh-huh. So I would say the calculation of what I would call cost balancing, i.e. taking into account a geopolitical cost, economic cost, and reputational concerns has not really changed in the last 30 years, that is in the post-Cold War period. But the kinds of coercive tools that China does use indeed change with regard to its frequency and the kind. So one example is that in the maritime realm, for example, in the South China Sea, China uses military coercion more and much more drastically in the 1990s. And beginning the 2000s, the frequency of Chinese coercion did increase, but in this post 2000s period, China's coercion rarely goes to the militarized level. And instead, China has been increasingly using non-military coercion and including gray zone coercion, which is the use of civilian law enforcement boats or ships, for example, Coast Guard ships and maritime surveillance ships to inflict damage on the target state. So the maritime realm, that would be Vietnam and the Philippines. This is largely because of the changing level of geopolitical backlash cost, which is defined as the concerns that the target state might balance against the coercing state, especially by drawing in a third party, a great power with whom the target state has military alliance treaties with. So in the empirical sense, that would be the United States. So we're seeing more use of non-military and gray zone coercive tools and less of military coercive tools, even though the frequency of China's coercion does increase over the last 20 years or so.
So, this notion that China's become more coercive, or that China's behavior is not as constrained as it was in the past, that's not an assessment that you would view as accurate. Is that correct?
I would say so. I think there's so the bottom line is that it's not the notion that China has become more assertive or aggressive is not entirely incorrect, but also at the same time it fails to capture the nuance of China's behavior when it comes to coercion. Because I think the outcome or the end result of China's coercion is mixed. In the 1990s, we see more cases of China's use of military coercion, which is more drastic if we conceptualize aggressiveness or assertiveness with the level of a negative use of a statecraft. With military coercion, shooting missiles, for example, or using the Navy to shoot fishermen more aggressive than the non-lethal use of civilian law enforcement organizations or imposing economic or diplomatic sanctions, right? So in that regard, China in the 1990s was quite aggressive and assertive, and I would say probably even more so than the post-2000s when it comes to the level of aggressiveness or the use of negative means of statecraft. But on the other hand, in the post-2000s, we do see an increased frequency of China using non-military and gray zone coercion, and the number of China's use of coercion did surpass that of the 1990s. But again, rarely did China use military coercion in the post-2000s. So I would say the catch-all conclusion that China is more aggressive and has suddenly become more assertive or aggressive in the post-2010 period is not entirely accurate and does not really capture the more nuanced questions of to whom, under what conditions, and with what tools China is becoming more assertive or not.
So, if I were to sum this up, it's more coercive but less violent?
Um, I would say so. That's partially yes, if we're looking only at the number of China's cases of coercion. But another, I think, conclusion that I've come up with, having studied not just China's maritime coercion in the South China Sea, but also its coercive attempts in the East China Sea, in with regard to the Sino-India land border dispute, as well as China's coercion regarding Taiwan and Tibet, i.e. foreign leaders' reception of the Dalai Lama. I would say the ratio of China's use of coercion to the cases or incidents where China deemed as threatening to its national security has stayed quite stable over the past 30 years. What that means is that, for example, in the South China Sea, the ratio has stayed around 40% over the last 30 years. So in other words, for every two cases where China deemed as threatening to its sovereignty in the South China Sea, for example, drilling oil or signing oil and gas contracts with foreign companies in what China considers to be its maritime EEZ. We're seeing half of the time China using coercion on a particular target state. So I would say if we're looking at or calculating the ratio, China's behavior has been quite stable over the years. So it does not coerce every time there is a case that it views as threatening to its national security.
So, where do domestic politics come into this? One hears a lot about how, with Xi Jinping's rise, domestic politics have come to play a more important role. But that's not the story you're telling here, is it?
Right. So I do agree that I've heard a lot about Xi Jinping as a individual leader being quite different from his past counterparts. For example, President Hu Jintao or President Jiang Zemin. I would argue that at least in the realm of the use of coercion, Xi Jinping behaves, or the Xi Jinping administration, I would say, behaves quite similarly to past Chinese administrations in the last 30 years. And in fact, basically all three presidents and the central leadership take into account what I've mentioned before, the economic costs, the reputational concerns in being viewed as strong and resolved and determined in defending China's sovereignty in the South China Sea, as well as the geopolitical concerns about the geopolitical backlash remain central in the decision-making rationale. So there are a couple things or examples to illustrate that Xi Jinping's approach to territorial disputes, as well as coercion in general, has not really differed drastically from past Chinese presidents. So in the 1990s, Jiang Zemin. It was during the Jiang Zemin period, but it actually was during that period when we're observing more use of military coercion, both in regard to the South China Sea as well as the Taiwan Strait. So in the South China Sea, actually, China militarily seized the mischief reef back in the 1994 to 1995 period. Whereas I think compared to 2012, the Scarborough Shoal and the latter periods, China has been mostly using its non-militarized or gray zone forces to complete the coercive actions. And another aspect that I think indicates that there hasn't been drastic of a change when Xi Jinping came into power is that a lot of China's coercive behavior regarding the South China Sea started back around, especially the use of non-military coercive tools, economic diplomatic sanctions, and gray zone coercion started way earlier than Xi Jinping's reign. So it started from around 2007, 2008. So that was during the Hu Jintao period, way before Xi Jinping gained a central power. And the Scarborough Shoal incident between China and the Philippines in 2012 actually took place in April, right? So that was when Hu Jintao was still in control, even though Xi Jinping came into power in the fall after this particular incident. And I think one additional example is not about maritime territorial disputes, but has to do with Sino-Indian land border disputes. So it was around 2006 that China started to use more active or proactive coercion, and especially military coercion against India more frequently. So again, that was during the Hu Jintao period. Part of it has to do with China's growing capacity, especially military capacity. So I think bottom line, domestic politics, especially elite politics, is not the most important explanatory factor when it comes to China's coercion decisions. The three presidents and the central leadership have been quite consistent when it comes to the rationale of coercion. And of course, some might argue that domestic popular nationalism might be the explanatory factor for China's coercive behavior. But I would argue that the counterfactual of domestic or popular nationalism having a huge impact on China's coercive behavior is that we would have seen a much more drastic use of China's military coercion if popular nationalism is the main explanatory factor for China's coercive behavior, because there are a lot of obviously, this is not a systematic data from opinion polls from the Chinese citizen, but there has been a lot of online backlash criticizing the Chinese government's behavior when it comes to the South China Sea, blaming the Chinese government for being too mild when it comes to the use of coercion. A lot more of the nationalistic public would push the Chinese government, or at least state explicitly online, that China should use military force to invade the Philippines or Vietnam, etc. So I think that if the popular nationalism were the domestic public were to impact Chinese foreign policy, we might not be seeing an increase of non-military coercion, but an increase of military coercion with regard to these maritime territorial disputes.
This has all been absolutely fascinating. Professor Zhang, thank you so much for sharing your work with us today.
Thank you.
And thank you for tuning in for another episode in One Big Thing in China Research. If you're interested in seeing other episodes or other content from the China Center, please do visit us on our website. That's the University of Oxford's China Center. Thank you very much, and goodbye.